Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ed Stafford again with Anatolian Dispatch, part of the Ahval News podcast network. I encourage you to look at all of the Ahval News podcasts to get more information. Ahval News is your best source of information about what is going on in Turkey. Anatolian Dispatch focuses mainly on the relationship of Turkey with Western countries, in particular the United States and other NATO allies. And today I'm speaking with Ilhan Tanir, the American editor for Ahval News. And we're just going to be speaking about some of the kind of major events that have occurred in the U.S.-Turkish relationship over the last week. So with that, Ilhan, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, hello there. I've been following your Anatolian Dispatch, and it has been very lively and very useful, by the way. I don't want to name, but a couple of those of your podcasts have been really wonderful, whether on the drones or the one that you just did a week ago with Jeremy on his book. He's comparing with 60 and 716. Very much looking forward to new episodes. Today, thank you for having me on. And, I would like to talk about this statement came out from the State Department on Tuesday evening. And it is, May 18.
Right.
And, it was pretty harsh. I mean, basically the US administration calls Erdogan anti-Semite. I mean, it says anti-Semitic remarks, but the statement, I think 3 paragraphs, basically saying that these are reprehensible. And this came after a couple of days after Erdogan accused and attacked President Biden. And Erdogan said, Biden has a bloody hand for selling or approving nearly $1 billion of new weapons sale to Israel.
Right.
How do you see this statement? Have you ever seen? I certainly don't remember anything during the Obama and during the Trump administration, which Trump sent a very harsh letter as well, by the way, saying don't be stupid. But this time, U.S. administration with institution coming from State Department and calling Erdogan remarks as anti-Semite. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, well, let's get the Trump comment out of the way right away. I mean, just to remind everybody who's viewing this or listening, Donald Trump, of course, did not follow the kind of normal diplomatic procedures. So he's probably the wrong comparator to use. He did make, the difference is that he used undiplomatic language, which was offensive personally to President Erdogan, and he shouldn't have used the language that he used. The difference is that now Ned Price is using classic diplomatic language that is of really almost the harshest level. And so Trump's comments were very personal, coming out of his personal feelings and emotions. Ned Price, as the official spokesperson for the State Department, that I can tell you from having worked on these sort of things in the past, there were a number of people that were involved in the drafting of that statement. It had to be cleared through several levels. Certainly, given the language that was used, it went all the way up to Secretary Blinken for his okay. If not him, it's possible was one step below him, but I doubt that. I believe, given how strong that language was through official diplomatic channels, I believe that that statement had to be cleared by Anthony Blinken. Well, I don't recall any time during the Obama administration, and remember, there's a lot of people from the Obama administration who are now in the Biden team, anything quite as harsh coming from the Biden administration about Turkey or about Erdogan or anyone like that. So this really is kind of ratcheting up. Now, what drove it, there were two drivers. One was President Erdogan's comment that President Biden had blood on his hands. That's a pretty severe thing to say about one of your allies, the leader of one of your allies. Then the other part was he used some language which, within the context of relations with the Jewish people and the history in the 20th century, is seen as dehumanizing and preparing for, aggressive action against people simply because they're Jews. And, there are a couple comments, specific comments about, sucking blood. He brought up this story again about Ariel Sharon having said that he got no more enjoyment out of life than killing Palestinians. So it's not clear whether it was one or the other. I would say it was actually both. I mean, clearly these kind of anti-Jewish statements about blood sucking, and there's a history of using that terminology, which is really negative. And then the other one of saying that Biden has blood on his hands. I think they combined to lead to the Secretary of State saying, we have got to have a really strong statement. Now, I'll throw in there, it's from the spokesperson. The only thing that's ratcheted it down from the most extremely high level, is the fact that it was the spokesperson speaking from the podium, which means it's official, but it was not Secretary Blinken himself. And even more important, it was not either by the White House spokesperson or by the president himself. So we're not quite at the highest possible level, but the language, certainly the strength and the harshness of the language for a comment by the official spokesperson of the Department of State, the equivalent of the foreign ministry. I don't think I've ever seen that from the executive branch.
Do you think Erdogan deserved this?
Personally, I think that the choice of words that was used, to my mind, they showed that there was a great deal of anger about the suggestion that Joe Biden had blood on his hands, along with the pressure from the Jewish community in the United States to take a strong stand against any really anti-Semitic remarks. That said, I think I would have done the phrasing a little differently. The problem, so I would say, one, something had to be said, and it was going to have to come from at least the spokesperson from the State Department. I don't know that the exact words chosen were appropriate. And the real problem is that this is just another reduction in the goodwill between the United States and Turkey, and particularly between the leadership of both countries. There's no opportunity, for example, for our ambassador in Ankara to have just picked up the phone, called the foreign minister on an urgent basis and say, this is going to cause a firestorm back in Washington, what your president said. Is there some way we can get it reduced? Can we get it backed away a little bit? Can we have him just put a gloss on it that says, in no way is he, does he have any kind of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic feelings? But he finds the conduct of the government of Israel to be unacceptable, blah, 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 something like that. But there's no way we can do that because the relationship between the United States and Turkey at the official level, it's not non-existent, but it's all being done now by public statements rather than confidential conversations, and private confidential conversations, which is where it should be. So yeah, I think
So
the language is bad. Go ahead.
Today, Erdogan continued to, I mean, he was not as harsh as, a day before when he called. By the way, I was watching his speech. I think he, went off the script when he was saying that bloody hands. And I did not expect Erdogan to, go against Biden like that because, we know economic situation is, very dire situation in Turkey. And in the United States, thankfully, it looks like we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I just got my second shot yesterday on, streets. I can see half of the people not using mask anymore, which a month ago it was 100% in Washington, D.C. So, comparing the many other countries, Turkey is still a lot of way to go.
Yeah.
Then tourism already got hit, and it looks like it's not going to recover very well. So, taking into consideration all those things, I did not expect Erdogan to, and today we are looking at the Turkish lira again going down, dollar is, I just don't know what is Erdogan's end game. If, do you think, here is my question, do you think he expects something fundamental, some change, fundamentally changing with the Gaza conflict? Is this what he's angling for?
Well, I mean, the number of times that Hamas in Gaza has launched rockets into Israel to generate a response and therefore generate sympathy for the Palestinians in Gaza, which is of course what Hamas is doing. That's been repeated, and I don't think it's going to end with whatever happens, the end game of this particular outbreak of violence between the two parties, between Israel and Hamas. I'm not sure that President Erdogan has a specific end game in mind right now that is real transformational. The harsh reality is that in terms of military technology and capacity and capabilities, Israel is always going to win in these confrontations. The Iron Dome missile defense system gives them great advantages, and even though they will suffer some casualties, they will be able to relatively freely bring a harsh military response upon Hamas. But Hamas is not going to go away. I mean, they can destroy many of the tunnels, they can destroy many of the buildings that support the command and control structure of the Hamas military, blah, blah, blah. But, the problem is still going to remain. You're still going to have Gaza. So I can't imagine that he thinks that that he would be able to drive the U.S. Away from being supportive of Israel. That won't happen. Domestic politics will not allow that.
This is a good segue to move to my another question. I'm wondering, the former President Trump was very strongly backed Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and also backed moving to capital or recognizing a capital. And we know that story. It was 100%. Right. But now I'd say even Trump was more pro-Israel than the Israeli politicians. But now we are looking at a new administration. What do you see? We have seen some remarks coming from some of the Democrat congresswoman and congress people
Right.
not condemning, but attacking the Biden administration for not doing more to, first of all, bring the ceasefire, put more pressure on Netanyahu government and the human rights, and then all that. And how do you see Biden administration so far handling the conflict? And one more question. Also, there is this Congresswoman Rashida Taiba, I think Taliba. There was a very interesting conversation, or not conversation, but interaction between the President Biden and herself on a tarmac yesterday. Can you touch that event a little bit?
Everyone needs to keep in mind that in most European countries, Turkey included, you form your coalition governments, you form your coalitions to govern after the elections. In the United States, we form coalitions to govern before the election. And then the job is to keep the coalition together once you're in office. The fighting in between Hamas and Israel is causing real tensions in the coalition. It is, the leader in some ways, or the strongest opposition to supporting Israel, is Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who is from Michigan. And the reason she was speaking to Biden, she took the opportunity. Biden was in Michigan, I believe it may have been Flint, Michigan. It's suburban to Detroit, to go to a Ford Motor factory. Well, of course, the Congresswoman from that district is going to be there. So she had a chance to speak to him, and she took that to press her case that the Israeli actions are, one, disproportionate, and two, in the more general sense, they're on the wrong side of justice. So she pressed that case with him. I believe the conversation was actually about 8 minutes long. There's, been some reporting on it. But within the Democratic Party, there are also people who are devoted friends of Israel. And their interpretation is that Hamas started this because it wanted to generate antipathy towards Israel. And they're seeing it as the manipulation of Biden and his team. Now, it's now being reported that Biden is pressing Netanyahu for a dramatic de-escalation. Well, Netanyahu is not going to de-escalate because he knows that if it became very difficult for Israel, if, say, for example, not only Hamas, but Hezbollah from Lebanon started lobbing lots of missiles into Israel, and that there started to be the movement of large amounts of Iranian military hardware supplied to Hezbollah via Syria, northern Iraq and Syria, that the US would support Israel. And now, that doesn't stop Biden from trying to get Netanyahu to maybe limit the number of attacks and the severity of the attacks against Hamas's infrastructure. But what it's going to do is it's going to cause a real fissure in the Democratic Party. The members of this thing that's called the Squad, which is some kind of the most left-wing members of the Democratic Party, Rashida Tlaib is part of that. The other people in it are Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, who is from Minnesota, Somali American. and Ayanna Presley, who is from Massachusetts, African-American. So there's this real kind of, and they have already said that they ally themselves with the Palestinian people's calls for justice, just as they allied themselves with Black Lives Matter and others calling for justice in the United States. Very clear, though, they're being very clear, they're talking about the Palestinian people. They're not talking about Hamas. No one in the United States is going to endorse Hamas. No one is going to come out and say they support Hamas's actions. I think in about a week, this is going to be over. In about a week, what's going to happen is Israel will declare that it has reduced Hamas's capacity, and therefore it can go back to the status quo ante. Well, it'll be interesting to see if whether President Erdogan, and ironically, is going to be on the same page as the Iranians to not let that happen. Clearly,
so the reflection of the Turkish-U.S. relations, obviously Erdogan has been probably the biggest backer of Hamas, along with Iranian regime. And one thing that yesterday White House spokesperson Jen Psaki was saying that either yesterday or 2 days ago, so far the U.S. government has made talks or phone calls with over 60 foreign leaders to talk about Palestine or Gaza and a conflict,
right.
And there is no Erdogan. U.S. whether the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the White House, and then National Security Advisor Sullivan, they've been all talking to different officials from Denmark to Pakistan to Morocco to Kuwait, Bahrain, anyone in the region, which I don't need to mention Egypt or Saudis. Obviously, they've been talking several times with those countries, and no call went to Ankara. And Ankara is claiming that Turkish foreign minister twice said, not once, twice said that Ummah, which is the Muslims around the world, have high expectations from Ankara to do something about the Gaza. So Ankara sees the leader, they see themselves as the leader of the global Ummah, whereas US is not even making phone calls to Ankara. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense for Çavuşoğlu to say that, Turkey is putting itself forward as the leader of the Muslim Ummah, of the worldwide Muslim community. Whether they actually have any rights to that, or in fact represent the interest of anyone more than themselves, maybe the Qatari, is an open question. The reality is the Islamic world has never been consistently and universally agreed. There's never been a final consensus on the situation of the Palestinians. And well, let's be honest, oftentimes the so-called Muslim street, as the term's used, the Muslim street, the protests that took place were instigated by their governments. And so you now have a situation where, sure, these governments are going to try to figure out, okay, so what's going on here? We know for sure that Egypt is not going to issue any statements condemning Israel. because it has no love for Hamas. It sees Hamas as an ally of the Muslim Brotherhood, who the Egyptian leadership sees as an existential threat. So, there might be statements that talking about the need to avoid civilian casualties and this sort of stuff, but there's not going to be, and so it's going to be difficult for Turkey to take that role. Now, to the larger point, regardless of whether Turkey is seen by the Muslim community as speaking for the Muslim community, in some ways is irrelevant. The reality is that Turkey is a country of 80 million people with an incredibly important location in the world. It has shown that it is willing to engage beyond its borders for its own, what it perceives as vital interest. So the fact that, as I said earlier, the United States and Turkey are engaging in relations via press statements or public statements. At this point, it's almost incomprehensible that Jake Sullivan has not picked up the phone and called Ibrahim Kalin. They're the counterparts of each other. And the national security advisors typically, you'll do confidential phone calls at that level between national security advisors rather than the foreign minister and the US Secretary of State, because it's easier to keep those conversations quiet, confidential, but apparently that hasn't been happening. Or if it has been happening, it hasn't produced any positive results. Blinken's phone calls and reaching out are very public, but why he hasn't, again, regardless of whether Turkey speaks for the entire Muslim community or only for itself, Turkey is a very important player in the Middle East region. And the idea that the United States leadership is reaching out to all the stakeholders, as we call them, in that region, and not reaching out to Turkey makes no sense whatsoever.
Apparently, Washington doesn't see any use to talk to Erdogan. I think I slightly, I kind of agree with the U.S. administration at this point. Talking to Erdogan, I don't know what kind of use. It looks like Erdogan burned a lot of bridges with Washington for years, and now he's attacking Biden with bloody hands, while he has an empty treasury, central bank is tank, so we'll see. I don't know what kind of relationship going forward we are going to see between the countries. There is a bilateral meeting scheduled in June in Brussels during the NATO summit. I'm very much looking forward to that meeting, and we still haven't seen the final ruling from the for the Halkbank case. It's still at the New York, and it's taking 6 weeks. It's very interesting that they still haven't been able to rule on the case, whether they go ahead with the case or accept Halkbank's and then reject the case, and then Halkbank will be obviously very happy. I don't know if you have any other remarks to finish this conversation.
Well, no, I would just say that part of the reason that this as difficult as it might be to maintain the conversation, diplomacy sometimes means having difficult and hard conversations with people with whom you disagree, but it's in the interest of your country to maintain those lines of communication. And I would argue that the United States should be maintaining its lines of communication. Fine, it might not be President Erdogan talking to President Biden, and it might not be Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu talking to Secretary Blinken. But the national security advisors, or our ambassador in Ankara meeting with people at the foreign ministry, and the Turkish ambassador in the United States meeting with people in the State Department, that has to go on because at some point, as you mentioned, June, there's going to be some sort of meeting between the president of Turkey and the president of the United States. And if it goes poorly because no one was able to prepare properly for it with their counterparts from the other country, that's not going to be good for either the interests of the United States or for Turkey. Someone's got to, you really need to keep that in mind.
Okay, well, this was a good recap of what has been happening, and we are going to continue, keep monitoring, and we are going to continue following your excellent podcasts. Thanks so much for having me on this week.
Yeah, let me put in a plug on, I'm going to be discussing with our good friend, Chris Kilford, retired Canadian Forces Colonel. We're going to be speaking in a few days and following up on some of the, let me just say, wider perspective of NATO members about the ongoing relationship with Turkey. We're going to try to get into a bit more on the whole Eastern Mediterranean issue, because it does have, one of the things that happens is you focus on a single issue, but there's all these other things going on. Turkey has a number of, as we like to say, on the stovetop, it has a number of saucepans that are boiling over.
Mm-hmm. I also would like to hear the latest update on the drone, export issue, whether there is anything more happening on that front, because the previous podcast you did with the Dr. Kilford was very much useful to understand what is that the export ban means for Turkish drones. I'm curious if there is anything more on that front. Thanks so much.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.